Hi. How are you? Good. Glad you're doing our welcome tonight. Thank you. They'll cue you, so don't start until somebody gives you a cue. We are so proud of our students here. I tell you, it is.
They're great.
Yeah.
I mean, the ones that I've met just having the pizza thing and all.
Yeah, and you can see quite a few of them are here helping us out tonight.
Yeah, I was talking to some
having
this
to set up
afternoon.
new chairs and things. So.
Angie, by the way, is fabulous. She's been so great.
Angie's amazing.
I know.
She is
I'm telling him,
fantastic.
you're the best.
Yeah, I'm just hearing how wonderful you are, and I was telling her I agree.
That's great.
Yeah. Would you? This is a relatively minor thing, but would you go into Rhodes and look at all of the pastries left over? There were 60 that they brought tonight for 22 people or something. 20 people.
They even catered it for
Just go look. So I wonder if Lawrence is not mobile, so I wonder if we're going to do some sort of a sound check. You want to? Pardon me. Okay, Gerri, would you say a few words to make sure?
Can you hear me properly? Is that okay?
I think it is.
I have a pretty.
I can hear you. I can read it.
Okay.
Do you guys need anything? Ready to go? You got your
We're fine, thank you.
Yeah, we're still a minute or two beforehand, aren't we? It is 7? Oh. Smarty. You are.
Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Samaya Parr-Kramer, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with a student worker after the program. After the presentation, we will have some time for the audience to ask some questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you're able and ask just one brief question. If you have difficulty hearing during the program, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers and they will assist you. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please welcome me and joining Associate Director, Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. We are pleased you could join us for tonight's program. Not pretty enough. The Unlikely Triumph of Helen Gurley Brown. This is our first evening program for the fall semester. But before I continue with our program, I would just like to ask you to take your program out, and I would just like to go over just some of the upcoming events. Next Tuesday night is our annual Constitution Day program. And I think for those of you who have been here before, you know that we have Constitution Day programs, and normally they are cases that go before the Supreme Court, and we get an opinion sometime in June or July. Also look at the Vietnam, 3 hours served. And for those of you who have not had the opportunity, we have the special exhibit, The League of Wives, right in the archive portion of it, talking about Vietnam's prisoner of wars and missing in action allies. So I hope you will have an opportunity to come and visit that. That is unique, and it will travel when it leaves here. So we're very fortunate to have it. I would also at this point say thank you so very much for anyone who's new that's been here, and for those of you who have been here before, thank you so very much for supporting our programs. This evening's interview will be conducted by the Dole Institute Director, Bill Lacey. Immediately following this program, we will hold a book signing in the Darby Gallery near the entrance to the Institute. Tonight's guest is an author who has worked as a features writer, a columnist, reporter, and essayist for more than 30 years. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, GQ, Esquire, and more. She was the first female contributing editor to Rolling Stone magazine, writing profiles of celebrities including Michael Jackson, B.B. King, Jodie Foster, and James Brown. Now look at that combination. And look at that woman. So when you look at all those people that she's written about, she's the author of several books covering topics like the story of soul music. And she also mentioned at dinner R&B. So if you don't know about R&B, she will tell you probably tonight, and women in rock music. Her most recent book is a biography of Helen Gurley Brown, the legendary 30-year editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan magazine. We're also pleased to be joined tonight by Mark Zwanitziger, a previous guest speaker at the Dole Institute and Gerri Hirshey's husband. Mark has done programs here before, for many of you who will remember. Thank you both for joining us this evening.
Happy to be here.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a warm Jayhawk welcome? There's a difference between a welcome and a Jayhawk welcome. Give her a warm Jayhawk welcome. Thank you very much, Bill.
Gerri, welcome back to the Dole Institute. We're
Thank you
delighted
so
to have
much.
you here.
I'm shocked to be in this chair, but delighted. Usually I was out there.
Okay.
It's lovely.
Yep, very good. Let's start with a little bit of background about you, because our guests, our attendees are going to want to know more about you, and then we'll get into the subject of the book. Could you, to start, tell us a little bit about your upbringing and why you were inspired to be a writer?
Okay, I was brought up in Connecticut, in public schools in Connecticut, and I was very shy and had an unpronounceable Polish name, last name. So when the teacher would come down the roll, I'd just go like this, oops, sorry. And, you know, so I didn't have to talk or be noticed. It became a habit to write my way out of anything. That was just what I did. And all through school and through college, I enjoyed it. I began an academic, what I thought would be an academic career, and decided no. I had a master's in sociology, but really what I do now is that, the writing that I do. So I just started getting any work I could. I worked at Family Circle magazine, which is a very big women's magazine. Back then, it had a circulation of close to 19 million. And I started out answering reader mail, stuff like, can I run Tang through the dishwasher to clean it, you know. But I did persevere and began writing for other places and for Family Circle. Actually, one of my first big interviews with a musician was Dolly Parton. I went on the road with her for Family Circle. It was heaven. So I decided I liked it a lot, and I began working for newspapers and magazines. I've almost always, with the exception of my time at the Washington Post when I was on staff. I've been a freelancer in that I've had contracts with different magazines. And, you know, I've always had one that pays the rent, and then you can make better choices when you choose your other. And you know, I ended up doing a lot. I think I'm best known as a profilist of, you know, generally famous people, but often not, and not just music, just anyone you can think of. And that, to me, it's all been about the conversations, which are fabulous, and that's what I'm in it for. The books are a different way of going about it, and honestly, this one came at a point where journalism has had a rough go of it lately, you know, and magazines and newspapers are not what they were, and it was getting to be just too disappointing, I think. So I was looking for a really good story. It didn't have to be women, and a friend, a novelist, suggested this. She said, nobody's done it, why don't you? She's great. And I had no idea what a great yarn it was until I dove in. So that's not in a nutshell, but
Okay.
that's what got me here.
Okay, well, I want to ask you about one other role that you had, because you were the first woman editor at Rolling Stone. What was that like?
Great. You know, I also wrote some sports. I wrote about women's tennis in the beginning. So there's two real boys' clubs in journalism: sports and rock and roll, or in music. You know, so they just didn't have a lot of women. They've had some really good ones since, and there are plenty more. But it's still very much a boys' game. And that being said, they were happy enough to have me, and I was treated really well there. My work was treated well. And that's always how I decide where to stay. But they also let me do some crazy stuff. You know, I really, Michael Jackson was an interesting experience. Michael and his boa constrictor. My children, that's their fate, you know, you tell your kids certain things. And I did that interview. He had never spoken to any journalist alone. Sometimes he would have his sister or his mother or something. And he agreed to do it. It was right when Thriller was coming out. And I got to his little condo in Encino, and he said, his big house was being redone. He said, I'd like you to meet a friend of mine. And he was shaking like a leaf. I was scary, right? I'm really scary. And so he says, I'm going to bring a friend of mine down to meet you. And he brought down about a 6-foot boa constrictor named Muscles. And I do not care for snakes. But this was he wasn't being difficult. He was trying to show me that if I had an unnatural or irrational, a fear of snakes, which are beautiful animals, he had the same about my kind of animal. So I did the interview with a snake on a stair railing with his head right here for 2 hours. And he was right. I mean, the snake was beautiful. I was fine. I did decline the offer to let Muscles hug me at the end, you know.
That was probably prudent.
Uh-huh. But, you know, it calmed Michael down. It sort of calmed me down, and I got really good stuff. So there have been great adventures, and I think that one of my editors there called me the nutcracker because they gave me all the hard cases. But I think that I got the story because I was always respectful, never pushy, and I always went into any story assuming I'm stupid. I don't know anything about the person. I always over-research, but that's okay. You know, you don't want to ask them questions that people have asked them a million times before.
Okay, let's go to the book. Tell us about Helen Gurley Brown's youth and growing up and education, and then how she got started in the advertising business?
Okay. She had an utterly miserable growing up. She was born to two school teachers in the northwest corner of Arkansas. It's kind of near the current home of Walmart, in the Ozarks, and very, poor. Not her parents were educated, but the rest of the family was. Her mother was one of 10 people, 10 children who took care of each child. She was the oldest, and she had a baby on her hip her entire childhood, and it was very rough. The family made it to Little Rock because her dad, Ira Gurley, managed to get his law degree, and he got elected to the Arkansas State House as a Democrat in a squeaker, and moved his family to Little Rock. And then, when Helen was 10 years old, died horribly in an elevator accident in the State House in the Depression. So it was a mess. Helen had an older sister named Mary. Mom moves everybody to California, to Los Angeles, where there's a relative she thinks will help. And the older daughter gets polio. So they're essentially penniless except for a little settlement for Ira's death. Terrified and worried that Mary will die. So Helen didn't get to, she went to one semester of college, but they couldn't afford anything else. She went to secretarial school. She discovered when she got out there to sophisticated Los Angeles that, hey, she had a Southern accent. And so it was the beginning of, a life of self-improvement, that she strangled that accent to death with elocution courses and everything. Her single years were the making of her in terms of who she became, but really they were years of scrabbling. She had 18 secretarial jobs. She did get fired from quite a few of them before she got to the place where her life would change. And that was an ad agency called Foote, Cone and Belding. And she had an interview with Don Belding, who would become the most influential man in her life. And it was a very strange interview. She walked in and there were all this crazy taxidermy, a big American flag, and pictures of Belding on the wall with Hoover, Truman, Eisenhower, and a few others I can't remember right now. And she thought, what is this? Well, he was a very big Republican operator, a patriot. He, with E.F. Hutton and Eisenhower, founded a kind of patriots organization called the Freedoms Foundation. But he was an ad man from way back. And the ad company, they were famous for the Smokey the Bear. They named Smokey the Bear. They created Smokey the Bear. But they also have a lot of big household products. Helen was his secretary for quite a while, and she was also quite a sensation in the office with the other men. And she became a copywriter, an advertising copywriter, which women basically did not do, through sheer dint of her very good writing for her boss. Every time he went on the road, which ad men did a lot, she would send these letters after him, these crazy little letters, but with all the work he needed. I should just say right now, she was so good at what she did. She had such instincts, and she was also such a character that Michael Weiner, the creator of Mad Men, used Helen and her book, Sex and the Single Girl, as templates for some of his characters, women characters, in the ad agency. She was, most people don't know, she was really well known in that business. She would become the highest paid female copywriter in Los Angeles. Some of her first campaigns were she worked for many years for Catalina swimsuits. And Helen was never afraid of work, never afraid to learn from the ground up. She had every grubby job you could possibly imagine. So Catalina decided they would send Helen out on the road and sell swimsuits for a month and a half. So she barnstormed the Midwest, stuffing, as she put it, size 12s into size 8 swimsuits. So if that was not, you know, dedication to the cause. Now, all along, just to jump back to the title, her mother had told her since she was a child she was just not pretty enough to snare a really good husband, a really rich husband, or whatever, so she'd better learn to use her brains. When she was in high school and growing up, she was tiny, flat, and had such terrible acne that she had X-ray treatments, which really gave her troubles later on, you know, just experimental by quacks and stuff. So she was always very self-conscious about her looks. She was always dedicated to self-improvement. So, but she was broke. She couldn't afford a salon. So she washed her hair with woolite. And then, Helen being Helen, a canny gal, she wrote to the woolite company and told them how wonderful it was, and they sent her 3 cases. Now, by the time Helen became editor of Cosmo, she was doing that for designer gowns. She just had the touch. She was all about the freebies, which she had to be. She was scrabbling the whole time. You know, she called herself uncouth and gauche, and she was. Her boss, Don Belding, and his wife civilized her, if you will. They taught her what a salad fork was, how to manage her money. She became, you know, quite an operator. So by the time she was at the top of her game in advertising, she actually was stolen away from the ad agency she worked for by Max Factor. They wouldn't have it any other way with the agency that they went with, a new one. So she moved, crying all the way, but Foote, Cone, and Belding could not keep Helen because they had lost a little money doing a very big ad campaign for a little car called the Edsel. So they couldn't match the salary increase, and that was that. So she went, and you know, she named lipsticks. Her archives are at Smith College, and I spent many days there. And I read a lot of her stuff and all of her lipstick names and all that kind of stuff. And she was pretty darn good. So let me see. We're almost at Cosmo. She finally, at 37, meets the guy she decides she's going to marry, David Brown, who was a movie producer at the time and later on would go on to do Jaws, The Sting, A Few Good Men, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So they were going to have an amazing future together. As soon as they had married, Helen gets called into the office at her ad agency, and they say, listen, we're cutting your salary by 1/3. And if you don't want to stay here, we understand that. But, and she said, why? What, have I done something? No. You're married. Your husband can take care of you. And, you know, you're just making too darn much money. She stayed. But she wanted to do something else. And out of that came a little book called Sex and the Single Girl, which is basically a kind of girl's guide to having a wonderful life as a single woman and not a shut-away spinster. Her husband aided and abetted her. He gave her the idea. They sold it. It sold. 2 million women went crazy for it right away. And she became infamous overnight because she dared suggest to the women of America that they should have equal rights in the bedroom and the boardroom. She believed equally in having a wonderful love life and having a wonderful work life was about work as much as she was about the fun, although she had plenty of that. And those tales, which I will not go into here, but kind of run through the book, show you what a lively person she was, and you know, knew who she was and just was great with it. And but she married. She called him a dreamboat. He didn't exactly look like a dreamboat, but they had a 50-year marriage. And so after Sex and the Single Girl, she ends up, too long to go into, with this moribund magazine called Cosmopolitan that William Randolph Hearst bought in 1905 to use as a muckraking tool, and it worked very well for him. He went after all the crooked politicians or the ones he simply didn't like, and he made a pile of money. But by the 50s, when television came along, Cosmopolitan, which was a general interest magazine, was really on the skids. But the old man Hearst loved it, so he wouldn't let them kill it. So they thought, well, it's losing money, it's losing money. Let's give it to this woman who knows nothing about magazines, which was true. She just had this great success with the book, and Natalie Wood playing her in the movie version of the book. So she started this magazine that became Cosmo, the magazine, the first real magazine for a single working woman. I was looking back because Helen had won a Glamour magazine contest that had helped her a lot back then. Glamour magazine in the late 40s, early 50s actually had a little line underneath the logo that said, "For the woman with a job," which surprised me. But Helen was the one who had the field all to herself because Helen had good luck with history. So in the early 60s, she took over the magazine in 65. There were a lot of more women in the workforce because of the war, and women had begun working much more than they had been. Women were leaving their parents' home earlier and living as single women before they married. The singles scene was kind of building. And a lot of women were moving to cities, and men too, to get jobs there and not stay in the small towns they were in. And these were her people. And she also had a pretty large married following as well. And so they thought, great, you know, we'll give her a year. It's going to be dead in the water. Well, you know, she had doubled it. Every month, it went through the roof. The sales figures just kept climbing and climbing. The ads, now, here's where, you know, she was an ad person. She was not afraid to get cozy with advertisers, like some editors were. So it suddenly got this fat. When I went to get all of the back issues that are bound in the New York Public Library, I couldn't even push the carts. You know, they were just jam-packed. And her secret, I mean, apart from reaching this audience that nobody was paying attention to, that was growing every day, was that she did the kind of editing that we all do at night when you are asking the internet questions you wouldn't dare ask anybody during the day. So, you know, Helen, it was just anything from like problem perspiration stains to, you know, what do I do with my boss? And she had a very appealing mix. There was something for everybody, and the issues were this thick by then. So she was a tremendous, tremendous success. She was also pilloried for her rather over-the-top creation, that Cosmo Girl, which, you know, was something I really didn't want much to do with when I was a young person. But the Cosmo Girl was very appealing to a lot of people, and she kind of became, you know, the hair got bigger, right, or whatever, that, you know, always been, but she was this creature of Helen's that I think people confused with what was in the magazine. And one of my surprises is that I looked, and between 19 65 when she took over, and 72, this gentleman at Colorado State had done an analysis of all of her issues. The amount of sex in that book was 5.2%. So perception and reality were very different, and it remained that way for a long time. Now I would say, you know, the stats have flipped and it's jumped the shark, as they say. It's really gone crazy. But in Helen's day, it really was not a sex magazine. And I think anyone seeing her on Johnny Carson at that point would think otherwise, because she was very flirty and everything. Another thing that was really important about Helen was that she was a feminist, not in your classic sense, but she was very, very invested in women's reproductive rights. I came across a lot of kind of horrible situations where she was just appalled by women's lack of access to either birth control or control over their own bodies. And so she hectored every president. I think she would probably right now be like over the barricades at Trump Tower. But she wrote to Ronald Reagan, whom she knew from when she worked as a secretary at MCA, and he was a handsome star in tennis clothes, sailing through there. She lobbied Sandra Day O'Connor not to let them, you know, get rid of Roe v. Wade. Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton. I found letters from her to everyone, and she was very active in a lot of feminist issues. She was also picketed by feminists and barricaded in her office in 1970, sorry. And she agreed to all these women protesting and telling her, you know, this stuff was too girly or whatnot, that she would run feminist articles, and she did, in fact, in that first, right after that run, an excerpt from Sexual Politics by Kate Millett. She ran Betty Friedan's piece. They never got along very well, but she commissioned pieces from all these women and did put that out there. So I think what I felt doing it is that I probably gave her a bad rap as just, you know, somebody who dismissed her. But I had a deeper appreciation for all the barriers that she faced that astounded me. They just astounded me left and right. I had no idea, even though I grew up during that time, that until 1972, single women in many states in this country could not be prescribed contraceptives legally. You know, I had no idea. So it's an incredible saga of a really, I would say admirable, wacky. I mean, she did things, she got herself arrested, she would throw tantrums. She was sort of unruly, but just a great dame. I've taken her up, you know, to getting this job, so rather than go through her whole life here, maybe you want to ask me something.
Well, I do want to go to some other subjects, but I want to conclude the discussion about the book by asking you to describe what you feel her legacy is.
Her legacy is that all women should be entitled to full lives in the workplace and the home, or their own home if they're single. And there should be no obstacle, and that those things should be, if you feel it, work and love, sex, whatever you want to call it, equally respected, equally available, equally permissible. I think her genius was populist. She never, ever spoke down to her readers. She liked to think of herself as a big sister, but she spoke directly to her readers in a voice that they could understand. No in italics, my God, you know. But just her sole goal, and in Sex and the Single Girl, where there are all these incredible tips on like how to make chloroform cocktails with bourbon and melted ice cream, which is what she served at her brunches, you know, and the woolite for your hair. She had a lot of aspirational advice for people and felt it. She wrote, you know, they became incredibly rich, the Browns, between Jaws and everything else. She rode the M10 bus, which stops right near our house, every day to work. She never took a cab, even though they bought her a silver Mercedes, Hearst did, because she wanted to see her girls. She wanted to, you know, so it was her voice and her real love and respect for the readers, for women. And she was a great friend to women. And I did appreciate that when I went to, you know, there were still a lot of people to talk to. So I found people you never would have heard of, but people like Barbara Walters, Gloria Vanderbilt, Joan Rivers. Oh, she was great. They all talked to me because they loved her very much. Liz Smith, the gossip columnist, was sort of godmother to this book because they were dear, dear friends for many years. And she was really the best friend a girl could have, you know. And I think that's just as important a legacy is that even if you thought she was a man's woman or something, the way she comported herself, it was women she truly loved.
Okay. Have you written about a number of musicians, and you told a story about Michael Jackson. I was wondering if you would, I said I wouldn't ask you this out here, but I've got a little bit extra time, so tell us who your favorite musical stars that you wrote about were, and then give us, if you can recall one, an anecdote about James Brown.
Oh my, well, I had a long and interesting relationship with Mr. Brown. I was terrified of him first, with good reason, because he gave me a really hard time the first time I went to see him. He lived in Georgia, and in Augusta, but out in the country. And I found out that somebody had been posing as a Rolling Stone writer and took James's money and his girl and skipped town. So I had a lot to overcome. It wasn't true, but, you know, and also he liked to test journalists, so, you know, it was interesting. But I really had great adventures with him. That was the first person I ever got mobbed with, you know, where the love, whatever you want to call it, is coming at you in waves of humanity that is truly terrifying. But because he was who he was, things would happen. He would call when he got to town. I was living in New York on 34th Street, and just come and pick me up to ride around. And you never knew who was going to be in there. So it develops one day, I meet him at a television studio, and I find myself in a darkened room with Muhammad Ali and James and Reverend Al Sharpton. It's, what? And it was actually magical because the lights were down because Muhammad was tired. He was going, my life is hotel, co-sale, hotel, co-sale. And, but they were talking, he really was exhausted. I don't know if he was starting to get ill at that point, but James and Muhammad were talking about their fathers and how much they loved and respected them, but how much they envied them because, as Muhammad put it, they have only got to be our fathers. The burden on them as any kind of role model or whatever was much, much greater. You know, I mean, so there were just these little moments that were lovely, that were unexpected if you ran with James. And he would stop in front of my apartment building on 34th Street, get out of the limousine and go like this and stop traffic. Believe me, he can stop traffic. So he and Muhammad Ali developed a game where they would see who could stop it for more blocks. They would do that, you know. So it was a great ride, and you just never knew where it would take you with people like that. And I found myself, you know, I was a child of Motown and all those great songs, and I would find myself on the bus with the Temptations. Oh, pinch me, you know. So, but in doing those stories too, you know, Motown was sort of over. I also found myself in recession era Detroit with people who had been great stars who were now living, you know, I'd be having dinner with somebody and their house would be foreclosed on the next day. And so American popular music is a very restless thing, and things change, and so everybody's fortune changed. You know, a lot of the people that I talked to from Motown knew Michael Jackson when he was 5 years old and told me stories about that. So there's a lot of cross-pollination as you go through a life like this, you know, speaking to people. I would have to say the best trip I ever had, the most meaningful to me, was to cross the country in a bus with B.B. King, which is kind of like going out with a combination of Nelson Mandela and Yoda. Because he was so wise and so kind, and my own father was very ill and dying at the time, and he was ill with diabetes. It was you know, he worked hard, that man. And we started in Connecticut, and I think we ended up in Tulsa. And it was just a magical thing to do, and to see how people reacted to him, people of all kinds all over the country. You know, it's a lot of fun.
Okay. I have one last question, then we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. So if you want to ask Gerri a question, you'll have that opportunity. And I think you know to raise your hand. Someone will bring a microphone by. Please don't start asking your question until you have the microphone, because we want to record it for our video. But my final question, Gerri, and we've talked about involvement of young people at the Dole Institute. What advice would you give to young people here at KU, and especially members of our Student Advisory Board, who are thinking about getting into journalism as a career?
Well, I would say it's the best of times and the worst of times. You know, I was fortunate to be in the the golden wave after Watergate and Woodward and Bernstein, and it was pretty plush. But I would say it's the best of times because they're great stories. It's the worst of times because of this whole fake news nonsense. I think that if you're interested in journalism, some of the best journalism is being done at the local level, and that you should get in wherever you can and work like the dickens. There's just no substitute for that. Every time I talk to a journalism class and I say, rewrite, they all go, ugh, but that's the only way I can work. You just, it's a business that is pretty relentless if you do it right. Do always assume that you're ignorant, and work as hard as you can to educate yourself before you go out on a story. And I think that if you watch, we're all a little bit hysterical now in news. Like, tell me you've ever seen right now any news program where breaking news isn't running across there. What isn't breaking news anymore? So. Everyone's a little bit hysterical trying to stay alive here in this business, but everybody's got to calm down and stick to the facts. And as long as you are deft and diligent at seeking them out and working like a little dog, I think there's a place for you.
Okay, very good. Let's open it up to your questions. Now, don't try to get my attention. Try to get Emily's attention or Alex's attention. Raise your hand, and you can ask a question.
Thanks for coming. Did you ever interview Frank Sinatra?
Never made it to the chairman, no. No, the closest I came was doing a long story on Kitty Kelly, who wrote that incomparable book and found out how she got that done, but no. Listen to him a lot.
What are you working on now?
Interesting question. I'm pondering my possibilities. No, actually, I am also going to do some pro bono work with a journalism nonprofit. I do think that some of the best work is being done now in nonprofit journalism because it's just the economic model of journalism is broken with paper circulation, ad revenue. We're still trying to figure out. I was just saying to friends, the New York Times is renting out part of the building for weddings. So we all have to do what we can, so.
Okay, other questions? Okay, gotcha.
Hi. You studied Cosmo and the history of Cosmopolitan magazine, and then you also mentioned how magazines and newspapers aren't what they once were. What do you think will be the future for Cosmopolitan, and what kind of role do you think it will play in the next few decades, in the next generation of women? Because it had such an important role in the past generations of women. So
that's a very interesting question, because Helen did not live to see this, but Cosmo is now reaching 68 million young women every month through internet, but also through it's in 100 countries or it was in print editions. There are 35, it's in 35 languages. Women in hijabs are reading it. The Soviet edition of Cosmo is the biggest magazine in that whole continent, in all of Europe. And that Helen started herself in the early 90s. So they are a bit over the top, but you must understand, for instance, in Afghanistan, you can't do a regular Cosmo. Their genius is to be able to reach the woman in the culture-appropriate situation. So they have editors everywhere to translate and to do articles that are of interest in those places. In Russia, in the Soviet Union, rather, the only two magazines for women were Factory Worker Lady and Farmer Lady. So, the field was wide open. So I think, a lot of magazines have international editions. Cosmo has gotten wise in that they are doing social justice issues, political issues. They know they have to do that. And any modern editor has that mindset, So a lot of women's health type things. And that, asking questions in the middle of the night. Women in places like Botswana or, again, Afghanistan or Iran have those questions. Within reason, Cosmo can help you with them. So I think that they have a future as a conduit if they use it responsibly. I have to say that the American version is, they're getting better with content, but it's still, I couldn't even speak some of the cover lines here, so.
Okay, we have time. Okay, we got a question over here.
Hello. You mentioned fake news. What do you see as the origin or roots of this phenomenon today?
Well, I would say that the root origin I couldn't exactly tell you, but what's made it epidemic and viral, if you will, is the internet, because it's so difficult for the average reader now, I think, consumer on the internet, to tell, because people are so good at faking stories and making up stories and putting them up on sites that look perfectly believable. So I think that in terms of spread, and the sheer numbers of people that reaches, that's the biggest issue with it.
Okay. We have a question back here.
Thank you so much for coming today. It's been so inspirational to hear you speaking.
Well, thank you.
And I wonder, out of all of the issues that you've, dealt with and seen and whatnot, what has touched your heart the most as what would be the most important kind of message that you feel like you could bring through at this point in time?
Wow. To me, every story and every conversation mattered, and that meant that the person or persons I was talking to mattered. And I've done, some hard ones, like with survivors of child abuse, and everyone. My takeaway is that I learned to treat people with more respect than I could have imagined, even people that I disagreed with totally. I think that I've learned tolerance from this job, and I wish there were more, and I do believe that fake news and the hideous partisanship now is antithetical to that. I'm not going to be Pollyanna and say it's going to get better before. Yeah, but I really, for me, it has been not about the kind of glamorous stuff, but the conversations. And one thing I will leave you with, people think I'm crazy for doing this, but we were moving, and I took all of my tapes of my conversations with all of these people who trusted me, and I got rid of them. I destroyed them, because I see what's being done with material like that, and they gave me their trust, and I felt, I've gotten a little trouble for it, but I just feel very strongly about that.
Okay, we have a hand back there, and then Emily, we have Professor Moran here too. Okay, we go back to the back first.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, what advice would you give young people, especially young women, going into the business industry? Like, what are some good tips just to deal with, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm looking for, like, just regular advice for young people trying to get into the business industry and everything.
Well, pretty much, as I said, absolute dogged perseverance, and always find a better way to go at something. It is the time in journalism to think, or in business, to think far, far out of the box. It's the age of disruption. Don't be afraid to do that. Don't be crazy, but, for instance, if you want a job in journalism, sending in a resume on the internet is not going to work. Sending in it by email is not. You have to go out and do work for free, that sort of thing. You have to really put yourself out there, because it's harder and harder to make yourself heard. So any opportunity that you get, as small as it is, an internship, again, working for free if you can afford it, or doing something else on the side, just to get the chops, just to get the experience, will pay off in bigger dividends, I believe.
Okay, we have a question right here.
Yes, as other people have said, thank you for coming. I had a question about Helen Gurley Brown again. Namely, out of this great output that she managed, were there any stories or subjects that she just could not get published? Something that had frustrated her, or she ran into obstacles, something that she just couldn't get out that she wanted to get out?
I would say there's nothing that she didn't get out that she wanted to, much of which should have stayed hidden. I came upon some of her fiction that she tried in the Smith archives, and it's pretty bad. And she realized that she couldn't write fiction. There are somewhere secret writings that she wrote for herself and her best friend since 1949, when they were both secretaries at the ad agency. And they are somewhere, if they haven't been destroyed, within the Hearst building. There was an elaborate ruse, and Helen's best friend Charlotte, who also worked there, had charge of these papers with Helen's deepest secrets. And they sadly both went into dementia before the locked box could be retrieved by her friend. And so, you know, they exist somewhere, I think. Maybe Hearst has them and has lit the match. I don't know. But she didn't have unfulfilled desires as a writer. I think she should have stopped actually after about 6 books, because she was a tremendous recycler.
Okay, we have a question back here.
You mentioned that you were often given the stories that were going to be more difficult. What did you find was the key to a good interview? RESPECT again, but I never in my entire life have asked a question at a press conference because A, I'm shy, and B, it's a useless exercise generally. I just found that a very laid-back approach and quiet in a way that demonstrated that you had done a ton of research. Sometimes I would just ask if I could sit in a room and watch the person do whatever they would do, and they'd start getting nervous because I wasn't asking questions, and they would just come over and talk. You know, you just kind of have to let it happen as organically as you can. I'm not one of these shove the mic, and I just couldn't do that.
Okay, do we have any other questions? You take one more question right here.
Yes, sir.
Have you ever thought of doing anything with Ken Burns?
I'm married to a documentary maker, so no. There's plenty of good subject matter for sure.
Yeah. Okay, Gerri, thank you so much for joining us
Thank you.
tonight. It was
Thank
terrific.
you for having me.
Gerri is going to be signing copies of her book about Ms. Brown, and it's an outstanding book. Great for Christmas presents, Halloween presents, Thanksgiving presents. So pick up a handful and get them signed and take them home. So thank you all for coming out. Hope to see you next week at our Constitution Day program. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you for